I'd like to welcome you to the University of Calgary. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, and the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nation. I would also like to note that the University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which is now called the City of Calgary. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Yes. My name is Kori Czuy. I'm a PhD student in Workland. And that's all.
Good morning, my name is Victoria Bouvier. I am an RA for this project, Decolonizing Dissertations event series, as well as a doctoral student in Workland School of Education.
And my name is Aruna Srivastava. I teach in the, I've been here a very long time. I teach in the Department of English and in the Indigenous Studies program. And for this year, thanks to the generosity of Dean of Grad Studies, Lisa Young, who's hiding at the back, I also have a part-time position in Faculty of Graduate Studies this year, looking at issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we're focusing a great deal this year on responses to the Indigenous Strategy. And I will say, I want to say, because I don't know if she gets enough credit for this, that the Decolonizing Dissertations idea was in fact Lisa Young's. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yeah. So, and a lot of the work for this, I do want to say this because I didn't last time, a lot of the work for this is Kori's and Vicki's. They have worked so hard on this project. I also want to thank Faculty of Graduate Studies and the Graduate College who allows us to use this space, and we're very grateful for that. And I have one more thank you to make, and I've forgotten what it is, but and Com Media, thank you for live streaming and recording this event. We've had lots of requests from graduate students off-site in particular who cannot come to these events to be able to see them. So that, I think, that's an indication of the interest in this series of events. There'll be 2 or 3 more next term as well. So I think without further ado, have I forgotten anything? Okay. Okay. So I'll be doing introductions to the 4 contributors who kindly agreed to share some of their insights about and reflections on decolonizing the PhD. This is the second of our events, and it's based on the questions we gave them were based on questions that we used for our first graduate student event in October. Vicki, do you want to share what those questions are? Yeah.
So we posed these questions to the panelists, and they'll just refer to them in their own way. So the first one, what does decolonize mean to you in your work? Based on your experiences as a faculty or graduate student, how can the university decolonize the structures of the dissertation or thesis? What role, or what is the role of mentorship in the decolonizing process? And what do you foresee as the possibilities and challenges to the process of decolonizing the PhD? And lastly, can you speak to your experiences transitioning from a grad student to a faculty member and insights that you have gained in that process? So when they have their opportunity, they'll just respond accordingly to those questions.
So Vicki is going to be our timekeeper.
Do you want to do the bios?
I will.
Okay.
Vicki's going to be our timekeeper.
I'm the moderator.
The timekeeper moderator. I will read the bios that were kindly provided by the participants. Can you hold the mic? I don't have many hands. Yeah. All right, so on your left, Rainford Prud'homme-Cranford, formerly Gomez, PhD, is I've done that already. Is, as she describes it, a fantastic indigenerd. whose book Smoked Mullet, Cornbread, Crawdad Memory won the first book award in poetry from the Native Writers Circle of the Americas. She's an assistant professor of Indigenous literature in the Department of English and also teaches in the International Indigenous Studies program here. Her current research focuses on transindigeneity across the Americas and the Circum-Caribbean in material, graphic, and literary culture. She has a load of critical and creative work published, so I'm not going to list where it's published, but it's an impressive amount. Makes me feel very small. Her current projects include the Gumbo Banaha stories, the physics of indigeneity and decolonizing the transnational South. Second project, Remember the Red River Valley, transcontinental Red River narratives of métissage, métissaje, and indigenous persistence. And she's a co-editor with Andrew Jolivet, Carolyn Dunn, and Daryl Barth of the forthcoming collection, Louisiana Creole Peoplehood, Tracing Post-Contact, Afro-Indigeneity, and Community. She's also the co-editor-in-chief, along with Carolyn Dunn, of the Painted Horse Press, a borderless indigenous press of the Americas. So that is Rain. Next to her is Jennifer Leeson, is a Anishinaabe from Pine Creek First Nation in Manitoba. She's an assistant professor at the U of C in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology in Indigenous Peoples' Health. Her research is Indigenous maternal, child, and reproductive health. Her particular focus has been women's reproductive health and their experiences of maternity from antenatal to postpartum care, and the kinds of constraints, barriers, and discriminations that prevent them from accessing appropriate reproductive care. Beside Jennifer is Adam Murry. Adam Thomas Murry is Ukrainian from his mom's side and Fort Sill Apache Nation from his dad's side. He is an assistant professor in psychology, where his emphasis is the practical and community-based application of research for community development purposes, particularly with tribes or nonprofits owned and operated by Native folks. His PhD is in applied psychology from Portland State University. And last but not least, as soon as I find it, is it Gabrielle? Okay, because I call you Gabe as well. Okay, Gabrielle Lindstrom, née Weaselhead, a member of the Kainai First Nation in Southern Alberta, is an assistant professor in Indigenous Studies with the Department of Humanities at Mount Royal University. She's in the final stages of completing her PhD in educational research with a specialization in adult learning. Her dissertation research focuses on the interplay between trauma and resilience in the post-secondary experiences of Aboriginal adult learners. Additionally, she has other diverse research interests ranging from micro-credentialing for educational development, meaningful assessment in higher education, parenting assessment tools, reform and child welfare, and anti-racist pedagogy. And that's it. So we'll pass it now over to the panel. We haven't actually talked about borders. So
don't we start with our Blackfoot women?
why don't we have Gabe start?
And so just quickly, how the structure of this will be, they'll have 12 minutes to answer the questions. When each of them will have 12 minutes, then we'll give them an opportunity to respond to each other, and then we're going to open up the floor for audience questions. So perhaps Gabe, and then we'll just go that way if you'd like to start.
So, okay, Nidaniko Tsabinaki. I just greeted you in my Blackfoot language. So greetings. My name is Slanted Eye Woman. That name was gifted to me by my dad when I graduated from the master's program at the University of Lethbridge. So I'm going to respond to what decolonization means to me as not only as an academic, but also as a Nitsitabi. Because I don't differentiate between the two. I'm who I am and how I teach and how I approach my relationships is very much grounded in my community, the values that have been passed down to me by my grandparents and my parents. So when I think about decolonization, it's a term that I was not entirely familiar with when I first entered into graduate studies, and I'm still wrapping my head around it, because I feel as though it really is about a process of getting to know myself in the context of my relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but also understanding what my role is as Nitsitabi. So decolonization for me has been a process that I've been, I would say, living through right from my reserve days to the time when I moved into the urban environment. And it really is about my identity. And understanding that a lot of my experiences in this country has been about my search for a deeper meaning of myself in relationship to other people, where I'm not feeling as if I just belong solely to the reserve. So decolonization has really been about movement off of the reserve and really searching for a feeling of belonging, this sense of belonging off of the reserve. So it's accepting and understanding that in some ways I'm a Canadian citizen, but in other ways it's about rediscovering who I am as a Nitsitabi person, a Blackfoot woman. So as I undertake the work, my research, and also my teaching endeavors in higher education, it really is about centering those relationships and undoing the traumas of colonization. And that involves understanding who I am as a brown woman, not as a brown woman who is trying to be a white woman. That was my life for many, many years. So now it's about reclaiming who I am, and in relationship to my students, it's about removing these power imbalances in the classroom, in my research, and understanding that power belongs within myself. It's not something that I impose on my students, or not something that I impose on other people. I believe people can decolonize if they start discovering that power within themselves. And that is the only power that is worth really holding on to. Because at the end of the day, if we try and impose our power on others, we're just stripping them of their dignity and their full potential to reach humanness, you know? So that's what it means to me, decolonization.
Did you have any other responses to the questions?
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, so what can the university do to decolonize? So being very new in my faculty position, I find that it really is, again, grounded in relationships and ensuring that the relationships that we're forming together as Indigenous, non-Indigenous people is based in that removal of power, and understanding that we have something to learn from each other in very unique and honest ways. Oftentimes, I find myself that I'm, convincing, or sometimes when you get into discussions with other academics, it turns into a debate rather than something where you're listening to me and I'm listening to you, and I'm understanding that what you're teaching me is something that's very, very valuable to me. And hopefully that is going to be reciprocated. So in Nitsitabi pedagogy, learning is reciprocal.
And it's the removal of power from that relationship. So in order to decolonize the university, how do you remove those power imbalances in an institution that is inherently hierarchical? So that's an individual challenge, which radiates and ripples out into the rest of our relationships with each other. So in terms of mentorship, again, I go back to the cultural principles of education, and whether we like it or not, we have to understand that we're role models to someone, right? Whether that's little kids, whether that's our colleagues, we're always being watched, and people will be learning from us, regardless of whether or not we're intentionally teaching. So mentorship is a natural process of learning, right? And so how does that happen naturally? Through those relationships that you make, through that removal of these power imbalances and that humility in learning, that we all have something to learn from one another, right? So for me, as I'm making my relationships with, forming relationships with people, or the relationships that I have already formed are evolving and changing, and I'm very aware that the things that I'm sharing are potential points of learning, right? And so how do we become very cognizant of that in terms of mentorship, right? And so even something like this, event here today, as a form of mentorship, right? Vicki is my very good friend, and we've been together since she started her master's and since I started my PhD, and we've learned from each other in very real ways, I think. And I've learned that even though she's younger than me, that I always have to listen to her. I've learned that the hard way. So
That's on record now, Gabe.
That's all right. So that's what mentorship is about, right? It's about humor, it's about learning, it's about love, it's about caring, it's about naturalness in your relationships, it's about moving those power imbalances, right? So some of the challenges I think that I've had in terms of my experiences here in the university have really been about trust. And the institution and those in the institution to trust that I know how to take care of myself as an Indigenous woman, that I do know how to do this, that when I'm entering into my research endeavor, and that it is quite sensitive, and the stories that I'm dealing with are they're about human suffering, to trust that I know how to take care of myself, and that I know how to honor those experiences and those stories in relationship, right? And so the challenge has been, again, one around convincing, but I think that's what you have to do anyways, but I still grapple with it, that convincing that, that I know what I'm talking about, and that a lot of the teaching that I hang on to is actually the words of my dad, my grandparents, my mom, my older sisters, my kids. And how do you defend that in a PhD defense, right? When you're expected to draw in the literature. And I tell that to my students as well, is, when I stand in front of you and we learn together through dialogue and through relationships, please know that a lot of what I'm sharing with you is based in what my dad taught me and what my mom taught me. It's not necessarily the theoretical foundations that I learned in textbooks or in articles. It really is about community and in relationship. So how do you defend that? So how do I transition this to my work? Well, it is, I think I've explained that quite a bit, and Vicki's rushing me, so I better listen. And but transitioning it to my work has become very natural for me because I don't. I wear the same hat, if you will. You know, I'm Gabe here. I'm Gabe with my students. I'm Gabe with my kids, with my friends, and so I find the transition to work has been quite seamless. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Gabe. Whenever you're ready, Adam.
Oh, okay. Is my microphone working? Man, it's a lot fancier than I thought it was going to be with the cameras and the fancy microphones. Makes me wish I would have wore a clean undershirt. Dagote, Hadinya, Yashin. Thanks everyone for spending the time with us, and thanks to my fellow panelist friends for sharing your ideas. This is a super cool space, right, to be able to have these types of conversations, especially like where it's legitimate and you're not like in some back hall room, you know, like worried that it's conspiracy, you know. But just opening up the dialogue. And before I mention or discuss any of my opinions about these different important topics, I do always like to start out by framing my perspective, right? Because that's going to be my bias. I recognize that I don't speak for everyone, right? And so I want to give just a little. I'm just going to talk about a couple of my biases first, right? So that you know, like when I say something about this or I say something about that, whenever anybody gives me advice, I always compare how similar that person is to me and how similar their circumstances are to mine, right? And if those two things are different, then even if they have good intentions, even if I really love that person, right, I still have to calibrate, you know, how much that's going to apply to my situation, how likely it is going to work. And so I hope that same thing is able to take place, right, by talking about this. So first, you know, from Aruna's introduction, right, you heard that my mom is Ukrainian, right? I'm mixed. My grandparents moved from Oklahoma during the 50s. This would have been the same time. So I'm from the U.S. In the U.S., we had two fundamental legislations that took place in the 50s. One was the Work Relocation Act. One was the Termination Act. Both of them got repealed by President Nixon as being discriminatory in their intentions, but they existed for about 20 years. And the work relocation, both of them, the goal was to get rid of the Indian problem. Okay, so the Termination Act basically just said, how can we reduce big government? Well, how about we just erase the relationship with the tribes? Dissolved 120 tribes, I think, 60 of which were in Oregon, and all of their land was drawn into a grid. You got to check it, government wholesale worth. Families got disbanded. You lost your access to IHS, BIE. Timber rights, water rights, fishing rights, all that stuff overnight, right? Like in Klamath Falls, where the Modoc Klamath were, I think homicides spiked. This is in the 1960s, like one of the highest spots in the whole nation, right? One of the Nixon's justifications for pulling it away was that it doesn't seem to be working. It's not working good, because the idea was that if they didn't have these reservations, they wouldn't get stuck with this identity and all these reservation problems. They could integrate, just become U.S. citizens. And the Relocation Act was basically using the poverty that economic embargoes had been successful against reservations for keeping them in poverty. You know, a lot of the reservations were useless in agrarian times, right? And that was the main economical drive, that type of thing. So they said, look, you know, you guys are so poor, why don't you move into the big cities and get jobs? We'll start an Indian work program. And sometimes that just meant a center, sometimes it just meant a bus ticket, sometimes it was like a pipeline project. It had a lot of good things. You wouldn't go to Santa Monica if you went to Los Angeles. You'd go to Long Beach, right? You wouldn't go to San Francisco, right? You'd go to Oakland, Right? You wouldn't go to Seattle, right? You go to Tacoma, right? And so the idea was that you'd end up in these ethnic barrios, intermarry with the Latino population and the black population, and then within a couple generations, we don't have this Indian problem anymore. Okay. What intermarriage definitely happened, right? And that was a big thing for urban centers. The other thing that happened was that all the native folks started finding each other. Instead of intermingling, native centers, urban Indian centers started getting created. Real famous one in San Francisco. A lot of folks that ended up taking over Alcatraz in, what was that, 79?
Alcatraz was
72?
4, when did he say, like 72, I think.
Yeah. I wish I would have fact-checked that before, and I always like to be accurate. Anyway, urban centers became a location where native folks started hanging out together, meeting together, being like, oh, you guys have a story for that too? Oh, you guys got a song? Oh, we got a song for that. You know, oh, you guys had that experience? And everybody before kind of thought about themselves as independent nations. And really, I mean, the first, National Congress of American Indians was the first intertribal, conglomerate to speak to federal power, and that was in 1944. So, you know, this consciousness wasn't pervasive for people on the ground. You know, it was just starting to be recognized by the tribes on a political level. So anyway, this urban Indian identity started to develop, and the powwows really took the place of a lack of cultural continuity amongst a lot of the tribes, and a lot of the California tribes had, by the time that the treaty process got to California, it was ruthless, right? And the system was learning, so there was still a lot of culture held by the folks that were coming out from the Midwest. When I go back to San Carlos, I always meet people that have been in Oakland, right? And so my experience kind of came from this. My dad's family moved from Oklahoma to Los Angeles. He grew up there. I was born in Southern Oregon, but then I grew up in Los Angeles, and so I had this urban Indian experience, right? A lot of my friends down in California are all Mexican. My family does put on 2 powwows a year down in Los Angeles. We are involved with folks. My aunt was the former director of a service for Native families with children with disabilities. My dad's involved with a bunch of stuff. So that's my experience, and so but it gives me a different perspective on I think some of these issues, because it's not the same contrast as somebody coming from the reservation, right? I've part of my critical consciousness, right? It's a fancy $10 academic word. I know some researchers that study it, and there's this tripartite definition, and each one has a sub-definition. But the best explanation I ever heard of critical consciousness I learned from a little old grandma at an Indian teaching education conference. And she said, critical consciousness is when you start to understand how your own life is a product of forces that went, social forces that are bigger than you and historical forces that came before you. And you start to understand how all that. And so, a part of my Indian identity, I guess, was understanding where I fell into the history. And so I just want to talk about that just for a second, so not only that you know me and you know where I'm coming from, but I think that every community, if there's a drought or something, there's a portion of the community that keeps doing what it's always worked, because it still works a little bit, not as good as before. And then there's a portion of the community that tries to innovate new technologies. And I think that I locate myself on that other end of the spectrum, right? It wouldn't even make sense for me to pretend to be some traditional ecological knowledge dude, right? Talking about oh yeah, walk in with some book on spirituality I'm trying to sell, it just wouldn't be appropriate, right? And so the position, the social position that I'm in informs very much the type of research that I do in my slice of the pie on this. All right, so in my last 4 minutes or whatever, it'll come up again in the Q&A. We could just tell jokes for the rest of the time. In terms of decolonization, maybe it's because I had a background in Christian apologetics, but I have a problem with decolonization because I think literally, right, when you decolonize something, if I had a bacteria in my gut and I took antibiotics to decolonize it, it means it would be gone, right? And so the colonial experience it defines all of us in different ways, right? And it's it's part of the human historical narrative, right? It wasn't very long ago, right, that, I mean, I'm going to refer to John Trudell's lectures for this if you want a much better way to discuss it. But, you know, Europe used to be a bunch of indigenous tribes, right? The human population is a tribal indigenous people, but it's been written out of the collective consciousness, right, intentionally. And it wasn't by accident. It was, 500 years of Inquisition in Europe, and Portuguese and Spain. And so, you know, there was an intention to get rid of your connection with the land, this idea of indigenization, right? To me is the connection with place. And so when I have these conversations, when I think about decolonization, it's not even that I like indigenizing better. I just have less problem with it. You know, I'm waiting for some young scholar to come up with a good word that describes what we're trying to do here, because I think both of those terms they get complicated in the details. But so rather than decolonizing, I want to talk about indigenizing, and I think with that respect, it kind of goes back into what you were saying with that sense of belonging, where the place that you're in is your place, right? I think that there's, I think all of us should become more in touch with our interconnectedness, right? I think that what the tribes have been asking for hundreds of years and still are asking for now, you know, is that we see each other as an interconnected unit, right? That we're all like exist in the same existence. That your existence impacts me. I've been loosening my grip on that idea a little bit lately because I moved to the suburbs, and so hey, my neighbor's problems are other people's problems, you know. Calgary's got so much suburbs. And so, you know, when I think about indigenizing the space, I think that in the structure of the dissertation, in the role of mentorship, I think that the structure, there's a lot of disciplinary constraints on that. I think it's different if you're an Indigenous Nation Studies program versus like if you're someone like me who's an Indigenous cluster hire in the Department of Psychology, right? And so there's a protocol that's been well established, very like kind of difficult hegemony to break through, and it having those standards makes it what it is, right? It defines certain parameters as being important, and then you're supposed to stop at those or incorporate those. And so when I did my PhD, I had 3 Native folks on my committee. I was super lucky to have that because I'm in industrial organizational psychology, right? It's probably the most non-Native space that I've that I've found in psychology. And you know, it was interesting to see the dynamic. Oh, all right. It happens in class all the time. I can't avoid it. Never stick to the script.
Thanks, Adam. Jennifer?
So bonjour, white. It's an honor to be here with my fellow panelists and to be in Treaty 7 territory. Ani kizi sage gadakwe nindishnakas niminwan damomai ayan. I was recently gifted the name for Shining Rays of Sunlight Woman from my uncle Norman in honor of completing my PhD. And that name carries a lot of responsibility. And the stating, Niminwen Damomai Ayan, I think really speaks to what Adam was talking about. It's Ojibwe words for saying and acknowledging everything that has happened in the past kind of leads us to today. And it's to honor all of that past, the ancestors, the wind, the rain, Mother Earth, and all those gifts and all those teachings, and what privilege it is to be in this institution and to be an assistant professor and working, and what a privilege and what an honor. So in thinking about what does decolonization mean to me and my work, when I was doing my PhD and even my master's, I fell through what was called the decolonizing rabbit hole. Because you're taught to think a certain way in our society and in my own history, and And all of a sudden you're faced with this word decolonizing, and what does it mean? And decolonize or deconstruct or disassemble, and what Adam was saying about it's about reducing something, and it's hard to reduce something because I think in Indigenous epistemologies and ways of thinking is that we don't always think about reducing and deducting it to something simple. And I think about our words and I think about our language, and in Anishinaabe teachings it's goyesh gawin, which is really a balance, and that it's really about building. It's about building relationships, not just reducing it to a single explanation. And I don't know if I'm making much sense with that, but it's about, so I'm kind of on the fence with Adam with the word decolonizing and indigenizing. I think it's both. I think it's about decolonizing and tearing away some of that thinking, but that it's also about indigenizing and building. And what does decolonization mean to me? And I'm sorry, I meant to work with our group. But I just want to share 2 photos with you. And I know it's difficult to see. I'm really sorry. But the first photo on the left is actually my grandparents. I'm going to situate myself and where I come from and how, I guess my historical narrative or where my critical consciousness comes from, those $10 words. But the photo on the right is a photo taken in approximately about 1933, and it's a photo of both my maternal grandparents. They went to Christ the King Indian Residential School just outside Camperville. And what you can't see in the photo that well is how are the children sitting? Mm-hmm. How are they sitting?
Are they kneeling?
They're actually sitting on their hands. You can see them in the photo. They're sitting on their hands. And I'm just going to demonstrate. So they're sitting on their hands, and the photo is the kids sitting on their hands and looking straight at the camera. There's no smiles. And in the back of the room is a nun. And the nun's sitting in the background. And so, I went back to my home community, and my aunties were talking, and because these are things that we never talked about. And so they brought out these old photos. This was back in 2009. It was in 2012. Lucy was just born, and Lucas was 3 years old. And we went back to our home community, and these were things that were never talked about. And all of a sudden, these photos came pouring out of the backs of closets. And I thought this photo was really interesting, and so making a community archive. So we were back in our home community, and in the basement of our church, and in Our Lady of Seven Sorrows Church, in the basement of the church is these huge cast iron safes. And inside the safes are every birth, every death, every record, everything that ever happened in our community since about 1820s is in the basement of that church. And so I went to the church with my mom, and I asked the priest, which is in this other photo here, I asked the priest if I could have access to those archives. I'm a good grad student, so I come along with my scanner. I'm going to do some community-based research and scan everything. And the priest said, no. He said, you're not allowed to scan these. These are sacred and confidential documents that are property of the church. And there I am. I'm standing up, and I'm furious. I'm like, what? Like, that's community archive. Like, of course I could scan like that. That's not property of the church. Those are my family. Like, that's our community. That's our history. And the priest is like, no, I'm sorry, you can't. And what you can't see in the photo on the right is we're sitting in the basement of the church. That's my mom sitting in the church, and the priest is telling us no. And how is my mom sitting? She's sitting on her hands. 85 years later. And what you can't see in the photo is that my mom is actually crying, because on those pages is the first time that she has ever seen her parents' and her grandparents' signatures on their wedding day. And she sat there. She sat there like this, on her hands. And I'll never forget that day, because we were walking up the steps of the church in the basement, and my mom was crying, and I said, like, Mom, like, don't worry, like, we're gonna get a copy. I'm not gonna stop. Like I'm gonna write the bishop and the archdiocese. I'm going to the Pope. Like, we're getting access to these archives. Like, I'm ready to fight, right? I'm ready to fight for this. And I'll never forget what she said to me that day. She said, Jen, she's like, who's gonna listen to a bunch of Indians? And that really made me think about the impacts the intergenerational impacts of colonialism and what it means to decolonize. Because, you know, I was in my master's at the time, and my master's actually became this space of no longer sitting on my hands. And the institutions, and you can see it here, the institutions are a space of power imbalances. You can see it in the priest, you can see it in the nun, you know, and it's about really challenging those systems and those institutions and these power imbalances. And for me, decolonizing was about finding my own voice, and finding my own voice and finding my own story, and using my voice and my story as a way to resist those spaces. And I work in Indigenous people's health. I work in challenging health disparities, specifically for Indigenous women. So really it's about, you know, pushing back, you know, against some of the health disparities, which is very biomedical, and doesn't really include, you know, it's very deconstructive, it's very deductive, it's very scientific, and not to say that, you know, that's obviously needed. And it's not an either or conversation, like Gabrielle was saying. It's not an either or. It's about, okay, yes, we need that, you know, Western medicine, but there's also Indigenous ways of thinking and being in the world, and that drawing from that knowledge is important. And so that's what it means for me in my work. The role of mentorship. I just got my appointment in July. But you know, I'm a mentor to my children, and I think it's about showing them that another way is possible. Showing them that another way is possible, because you know, my grandparents died in their 60s due to addictions and from stomach cancer. My mom passed away actually in the second year of my PhD from a massive heart attack. From alcoholism, and to me it was about, you know, ending those negative cycles, but that we're each on our own journey and of healing. We're all on this journey together, and that decolonizing and indigenizing is different for everyone in their process and who they are. But for me, it's about showing them and my students that another way is possible, and that anything is possible. When my mom said, you know, who's going to listen to a bunch of Indians? I tell my students, man, you raise your voice and you raise it loud and proud, because we're here and we're not going anywhere, and we're challenging, and it's a great time to be here. The challenges in the process, what are the possibilities and challenges in decolonizing the PhD? I think it's a lot about what Gabrielle and Adam were saying about deconstructing some of the power. That's a tough question. I don't know if I fully even answered that in my own dissertation, because you know, there's some spaces that are ready for change, and there's some spaces that aren't ready for change. And I think that it's a great first step in wanting to indigenize our academy, but I think we still have a long ways to go. Can you speak to your experience transitioning from a grad student to a faculty member? It's pretty awesome. I'm not poor anymore. Oh my God. I bought a house. I'm paying off my student loans. My kids got to play hockey this year. Hey, we're a little bit more settled and stable, and it's awesome, and I wish you guys all great success and wherever your journey may lead you.
Thank you, Jennifer. When you're ready, Rain.
Bonjour, yepamo. Halito sahochifout, Rain Prud'homme-Cranford. Chiokla put holisoholitopa untuklo yokoke mesi. Hello, my name is Rain Prud'homme-Cranford. I want to particularly give thanks to the nations who call Treaty 7 their homelands. Yokoke mesi, thank you so much for letting me live and work in your home territory. I'm very grateful. Also, thank you to the graduate school, to everyone organizing, and to my fabulous cohorts here. So much has been said, and that is important, and I think there's a large thread of commonality. And I see some of my students and colleagues in the audience, so I apologize in advance because I'm going to harp on kinship and relationality, which is what I harp on in my classrooms. I think I want to talk about the connection between kind of decolonization and indigenation, what it means to me in my work, and that role of mentorship combined. I think there's a natural, tangential, or intersectional relationship there. I tend to kind of agree with a lot of what has been said about what decolonization means to me. I remember sitting in Oklahoma. I'm from Oklahoma. I remember sitting in Oklahoma at the University of Oklahoma during my oral defense of my dissertation. And I was super lucky because every single member of my committee was of Indigenous descent. And first, I think that's an experience every Indigenous person should have. It shouldn't be a luxury. It was a luxury for me, but it shouldn't be a luxury. And one of my now colleagues asked, what is the role of decolonization, do you feel, in your work? And I remember being stumped for a moment because I was still grappling with both indigenization and decolonization. And that idea that I'm writing in English, I'm speaking in English, I follow the laws of the state and the nation supersede the laws of my family, my community, my communities that I am beholden to. And I remember answering, I don't know if decolonization is fully possible. And I know it sounds kind of harsh, but now I don't feel like I'm alone, so yay. But this idea is that colonization is a violence, right? And a violence leaves scars. And I don't know if Native folk, we have this really cool genetic thing that happens when, like, more times than not all folk, but particularly among people of color, particularly higher incidence among Indigenous and people of African descent, injuries heal keloid, right? It's that raised scarring that occurs, right? Sometimes that's the only way you can tell that I'm not white. But so when you think of colonization as that violence, as that opening, that ripping, right? As we go forward and as we heal keloid. Those are internal tributaries, maps, topographies of where we've been, right? They don't go away because they are inherited, because we move through life continuing to go through a frictive experience, living under paracolonial, right, society. My aunt's texting me. So I sometimes call this like the colonizer's tattoo, and it's something that all Indigenous folks carry. So the act of decolonization in and of itself is almost violent, right? To take away, right? To kill, to remove these concepts, these ideologies, so that your first response is not, colonization centers on a individualistic, right? Western colonization, on that individualistic. When we talk about residential and boarding school processes in the US and in Canada, when we talk about termination and relocation, when we talk about things that the equivalent to kind of termination and relocation was the attempt at the white paper here in Canada, right? And so when we talk about these things, and the the eradication, the discounting, the removal, and the ways to create nuclear families, right? To eradicate communal ways of knowing and living, right? Means that it's to stop also, not only to stop a culture and a way of being, but to end a responsibility. And so one of the things that I start all my classes with, and I know my students, and I bring it up so much that they're probably like, oh my God. We know. Is I talk about when you go home, the first thing people ask is who your people be, right? And you figure out who you are and who you are to someone by how you're related. And even up in new territory, we figure out how we are related because somehow you know somebody, right? But it creates a responsibility. And kinship, when we think about kinship and reciprocity, right? When you think of someone as your relative, right? It changes how you relate to that person. We have a phrase, Yakaniya Shakana and Choctaw, that means the land is the memory, the land is the record keeper. Because that relationship is a kinship relationship, all relationships move kind of in a spider web out of that concept. So if my classroom becomes a community, then I have to be an advocate for my students. If my PhD and MA students, if we enter into it's a sacred bond, it's a relationship. And particularly for someone like me who can passe blanc, right, who has that privilege that my sister doesn't have, or my dad doesn't have, or my grandma didn't have, right? That means I have even more responsibility to speak up and advocate for those who are going to be further marginalized because I have light skin privilege, because I can move a little bit easier in this world. So that part of decolonizing is one thing, but we can also take, right, what the Academy offers and make it our own. I mean, the standing joke, you know, I come from a family that's also part of the powwow circuit in Oklahoma, right? Duct tape, the best thing in the world. I mean, you need to put on your bells, duct tape, right? You know, it starts Oklahoma, tornadoes, y'all. It starts raining, can't wear your mocks. My sister's the best at making makeshift shoes out of duct tape, right? The ways in which you take these things, or we take these things in and make them useful and of use is particularly important. But those things we have to be responsible. We have to remember those kinship abilities, and we have to give back to communities. Because if the work that we do here is not viable where we come from and who we are beholden to, then we are engaging in the same type of smash and grab archaeological BS, I caught myself, that non-Indigenous folks have been engaging in from the beginning. So that's my spiel. Here, Kori.
Thank you, Rain. I didn't even have to give you the timer. So in light of time, and you guys have already sort of spoken to each other, so we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So all that I ask, if you do have a question, and if it's for a specific panelist, you just say who it's for and then speak into the mic. So we'll open it up. Is there any questions that anybody has? And grab coffee and food. Yes. Do you have a question? Okay.
How long was this meeting?
So far, it's been 1 hour. Thank you for your question. Almost there, almost there. Are we there yet?
So I'm a little nervous asking the first question, but I was wondering if any of you have had the chance to see the new Indigenous Strategy from the University of Calgary? And if so, thoughts? What do you think are the opportunities? I'm especially interested in what do you think are the challenges, going forward. So.
I can speak to that. So I was at the opening last week of the strategy, but I also did some work on it around the community consultations and gathering the stories of community on campus and in the city as well around what indigenization meant. And so I think in terms of moving forward and some of my general thoughts on it, what I really appreciated about the strategy and the university's approach to the strategy was really that notion of walking this parallel journey and incorporating the teachings and the spirituality as well of indigeneity. And for me, that was really important. It really was about honoring those perspectives, and I got the sense that it was really about learning from those perspectives as well, you know, in relationship, which was really important. So I really appreciated how the strategy itself was transferred in traditional ceremony to the president's office as a very distinct responsibility. And in Indigenous communities, and I can really only speak from my community perspective being Blackfoot, but we're always talking about responsibility, right? And how we need to be responsible to self, to each other, to our community, of course, and to, you know, to these relational alliances that are all around us, right? Include our responsibility to the land, and so that was the spirit that I got from the strategy, was responsibility to each other, and I think a reciprocal process for sure. So I hope that answers your question.
I would like to add to, I think all of us were there, which was really wonderful, but I was particularly pleased and happy to see not only is a strategy in a Western alphanumeric, but that it's represented in Blackfoot pictograph. I think that kind of moves, hopefully, like a discussion like this when we talk about decolonizing the dissertation, these foundational things. So as Gabe, you mentioned before, you feel like you're kind of arguing for position. We argue for positionality, right? That it lays the groundwork for not having to explicate or make an argument for why other forms of language are viable forms of language, right? And that language in of itself in most, I'm not going to say all, but most, I'll probably say all, Indigenous ways of knowing, it relies on a kinetic relationship, right, between not just a single speaker, but a speaker who is then tied to a community or to a place of being and knowing and understanding, and the history that comes before and after, and in that moment, and those who are listening. And that is in and of itself one of those sacred relationships.
Yeah, I might actually jump on what you said. Hopefully touch on what I think some of the challenges might be. I liked the Indigenous Strategy thing that they did. You know, I thought it was like a big celebration, and in the university's own way, it was like, look it, we're bragging, like this is what we're doing, you know, and to have like a solid project, you know, that's like collaborative, be the thing. It's just it's unusual for me as somebody from the States, I guess. But you know, I think one of the challenges, and they did a really good job. I think Drew Marshall was saying in the beginning that they put together a steering committee, and they started identifying priorities, and they did their whole organizational development thing. And when Reg was like, look, if you want to do this, you might want to think about if you're going to do it in an Indigenous way, you might think that it's going to have to look different. And they're like, you're right, and they threw it out and started it over again. And I thought, you never really get to hear that. And that's a super cool thing, to be even open to thinking about something differently or going about it in a different approach. My concern, I guess, might be one of the challenges is that, these are relationships between people. And so the commitment is between people. And universities have an interesting way, or all corporations, all entities kind of have this unusual way of like, I represent the university, but the university doesn't represent me. So as soon as I move out of my position, the next person isn't required to meet the obligations of those relationships. And you can remember some of the criticisms from the early tribes saying, and even during the 60s civil rights movement, this came up again, saying like the fact that you don't honor your treaties means that you don't have any respect for the words of your grandfathers, right? Because they made this commitment, it's supposed to be your commitment, and the redefinition, and this is like something that gets talked about a lot, right? The difference between the Western kind of empire and culture, right? This emphasis on individualism, it's only been hyper accentuated with like capitalist agendas, neoliberal agendas. It makes us define each other differently. And so the expectations of relationship, I wonder how we're going to jump that chasm, because it's still within a context that's written on different values. And so I think that the struggle for a University of Calgary is that the people that had those relationships, the people that went through that ceremony, the people were like, if it didn't work, would feel like the onus of responsibility, like, oh, this is affecting us, right? It's not like, oh, sorry for the Indian program dissolving, It was like, no, this is something I'm mutually invested in. And I think that how do you do that without that whole group of people having that experience and then transferring that successive planning, right? And maintaining that relationship that keeps on going, right? Because the event was real, and we could all tell, like, hey, look, these folks really seem to be close with one another, and there seems to be good blood between them. But then what? Now what? Then we're done with this Indigenous strategy, and I've just seen it happen so often. And I really liked what you said earlier about, the power within each one of us, because I think that that mentorship model applies to the Indigenous strategy continuing just as much as it applies to us and our graduate, mentoring graduate people. I attempt very much to try to be like authentic no matter where I'm at. What'd you say? You're Gabrielle when you're at home and when you're your students. And I think that's not necessarily a natural thing within the institution. I think that people come to work and they have their work face on. You make workplace jokes, and then you you talk about workplace things, and then you go off and you have your real life. And that compartmentalization, we've taken it for granted now. There's a lot of ways that we have to think about how it affects relationship, especially when an Indigenous strategy is based on that. And I watch it happen all the time. I think it's one of the perks of being somebody who's in the middle of two worlds is I watch people talk past each other a lot in conversations. And I'm like, oh, well, actually, he meant it like this, or actually, you know what, she meant it like this when she said that. But not being able to intervene, just like being, oh. Right? This isn't going to be good. Both sides walk away being like, that went well.
That's really good.
And even the idea like of success, right? It's defined differently. Like, we're moving from the graduate school to the academy was pretty liberating, because you almost feel like legitimized, like, all right, now see what you can do, with all this stuff that you've been selling, and that, like I said, that individual, that like when you're mentoring somebody, when you're involved with somebody, you're building that relationship, and I feel like that's the locus, of control. That's where it's going to happen. That's the site. Making real relationship with somebody, everybody knows when it's corny, right? Everybody knows when you could gauge people in your own life and within your inner circles, right? By like, how much they ask you a question, they're not really even listening to your answer. You know, I mean, like there's stuff like that. You know, and I think that that all kind of goes hand in hand because you know, we're kind of in a new place. You know, I think about myself as like a space holder for somebody else that is going to be able to do this better than I am, right? But for the meantime, you know, I'm just like I'm not just holding hands with the people that are to the left and right of me. I'm also holding hands with the people that went before me and the people that will go after me. Right. So I don't know. I just wonder how that's going to be handled in a setting like the university.
Okay, thank you. My name is Christine Walsh. I'm a white ally living on Treaty 7 territory, and I appreciate being able to live and work here. I also thank you for your words, and I have a question that you've in part answered, I think, for me. As a non-Indigenous person who is a PhD supervisor of an Indigenous person, I understand from your words that relationships are really key. So do you have other words of advice for me?
Jen? We all talked on the last one.
I should also say that it's unlikely that we'll have the privilege of having all Indigenous people on the supervisory committee. So
I'm just going to throw one thing out there. One time, a buddy of mine, he's Taos Pueblo, and I was living in Tucson not that long ago, so I was down in Tohono O'odham territory. He was driving from his reservation out to Los Angeles, and he stopped by and he asked me how I was doing. I told him I was teaching a class, and he goes, "Well, where are you teaching the class?" And I said, "Oh, U of A, University of Arizona." Not. And he goes, "Oh, what class are you teaching?" I said, "Oh, I'm teaching research methods, mixed methods course." And he said, "Oh, which department?" I said, "American Indian Studies." He goes, "How many students do you have are Native?" I said, "Actually, all of them." He had just a small class. There was only like 5 or 6 of us, but all of them. And he goes, "So everybody gets an A?" And I go, I was like, "Of course they do, man. They're Native students. I want to give them A's." No, I didn't say that. I think one of the things that gets hampered, and I don't know whether or not to write this off as being like ambiguity about how to treat people where you know there's a tense past and you're trying to be accommodating to cultural differences, and there's that intention there, but it's vague, and so the tendency to like the lower the standard, I don't think that it helps us. I think that the emphasis on relationship means that you're authentic, real person. It doesn't mean that you lower standards or make things easy, or like, you know what I mean? I mean, that affects the quality of the relationship. I think that when I was doing my dissertation defense, which was very like typical, I'm an IO psychology, so it's very businessy. It's, I mean, like they had to grill me for 2 hours hard. I knew that it was going to happen. But when I walked in, some of the faculty members that were there that were non-native, they walked right past me when they walked in, right? Wouldn't look at me, wouldn't talk to me. I'm about to like do this thing, right? Been working on this for years, right? It's like my blood, sweat, and tears. Like, what if this doesn't work? So much writing on it. And they walked past me. They're about to evaluate me for 2 hours. They don't want to like be biased by like looking at me in the face, feeling that, like that they like me or anything like that. So they just walk right past me. 2 of the other guys show up. They just kind of throw me like a wink. They're both like half native guys. The one full blood native guy, Kiowa Comanche guy, shows up late. I'm waiting outside the room for him. I got my hummus waiting for all the people at the committee because you got to give hummus at dissertation defenses. And he comes up and he doesn't say anything to me. He shakes my hand and gives me a quick like hug and then walks in. And I thought like he didn't need to say anything to me. I thought like he was treating me like a human. He knew like, look, I was in your spot one day. Another time, someone else will be in that spot. It doesn't make us better or worse human beings. He still acknowledged me as a human being. And then he went inside. And then he grilled me for 2 hours. Right? So I thought like it was a different way of interacting with somebody. It was a different way of acknowledging my humanity. With the other guys, they wouldn't talk to me until I had like shown that I was worthy or something. And and I understood like that the academy does this, and it was worse for my other fellow graduate students in certain circumstances than it was for me. So I don't think it was necessarily a culture thing. But here was this grueling experience, and I didn't think that it needed to be that way. Like, why did the relationships have to be set up that way? You know, and how are we going to do it differently, you know, if we have that space as, you know, Indigenous scholars? Like, because I still want the quality to be good, right? I still want those students that are coming up to replace us, you know, to have their stuff together.
I think I can speak to that. So I didn't have the luxury of having all Indigenous faculty on my PhD committee. I was mentored by Dr. Naomi McPherson, who's Professor Emeritus. She's an anthropologist who worked in Papua New Guinea, non-Indigenous. And the other supervisor was Dr. Patty Jansen from University of British Columbia. She's a perinatal epidemiologist. And in thinking about their mentorship as non-Indigenous faculty, as an Indigenous PhD student, I was talking to Cora Voyager, who is faculty here, and she said, if I can give you any piece of advice, she said, is to be gentle with your students. That was her advice. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about my own mentorship and how they were gentle with me, because a 4-year program actually took me 7. And there's reasons for that, and I shared a little bit about my history and that kind of unraveling. It was the decolonizing rabbit hole, is that I had to kind of, excuse me, I'm gonna get a little bit choked up here, but you're healing along this journey. And I think, you know, some of our grad students, this isn't just theory that we're talking about. This isn't just content or curriculum that we're talking about, that these histories and these narratives are embodied. And they're embodied and lived, and that a lot of my courses were triggers for me. So yes, I can write that paper, but I just need an extra week to get my poop in a group to kind of work through that paper first. And if that means taking that week just to step away, I just need that extension, and not to say that you're gonna go easier on me when you grade that paper, by all means. I don't want a free ride, I don't want an easy ride, I wanna be up to the same standard as everybody else. But I think we need to also give our students space and have that gentleness to allow them to take that time to heal in this process, because it's not, one, the content isn't easy. 2, the institution isn't easy. Being here, I'm the first kind of generation in academics. That's not easy. And if I need a week to go to winter dance with Auntie Molly, or if I need that week just to go home and reconnect and get grounded in who I am so that I can continue on in my journey, I think that's the only piece of advice I have for you, is just be gentle and understanding.
Hello, my name is Larissa Lai. I'm Chinese Canadian via Hong Kong, California, Newfoundland, and British Columbia. Thank you all very much for your amazing words and talks. I'm learning a whole big bunch. I have a question kind of following up. Jennifer, thank you so much for that just now. It was very moving. I have a question, and it connects to what you just said, and also what Adam said in his talk about the dissertation being a kind of protocol. And I guess my question would be, are there other forms and other modes, other ways that the dissertation and all of the apparatus around it, including the oral exam and all of that, could be structured or formed differently to make space for, because Jennifer, just now you demonstrated, like, I think really profoundly, ways of knowing that include feeling. That we don't necessarily admit, you know, into the kind of Western, form of the dissertation. And I wouldn't wonder, it's for all 4 of you. I mean, I'm thinking through the things that 2 of you said, but I know that all 4 of you will have thoughts, so I just wonder what you think and feel.
I just, off the top first, I'm so glad you're here. Larissa's awesome. It motivates me to be a better scholar and human. So thank you. When I went in for my defense, my parents wanted to know if they could be there, right? It's a very, mind you, I'm in my 40s, and I got my PhD in the midst of separating from my spouse, and coming out of like a hellish lupus kidney failure thing. But my parents were like, it's this big rite of passage ceremonial thing. Can't family be there? And then I think, you know, like I come on my dad's Louisiana Creole and Choctaw Biloxi. If you know anything about those types of communities, that means like you're related to 9 billion people. And so, and then once my parents, and then my sister, and then, you know, cousins, and we're like, ooh, can we Skype it? Right? And at once it was, because I was in that mindset of, I've got to prepare for this hoop jumping, this rigmarole, this grilling, this dragging across the coals. It's going to be awful. Was, you know, oh, that's such a silly question. It's the academy. They don't do that. Right? But it gets me to thinking about how integral and how important, right, taking those moments out for my family were. And I don't think I would have gotten through the process if I hadn't been in Oklahoma or Louisiana, where I had access to my family, where I had access to community, where I could just go and hang with, you know, my nieces and nephews, because they made me be me again, right? And I've never learned the compartmentalizing thing. I've never learned how to put on a mask and be somebody for my students and then somebody else for my colleagues. Unfortunately, what you see is what you get, and it often includes profanity and way too much reference to science fiction. But I think the dissertation process, right, if it is a relationship, right, if we think about it as a relationship forming process, right, and if we think about it as a ceremonial process, right, that includes all these different forms of what, you know, in English or CRL we call rhetorics, right, but are just ways of knowing, right, then we need to learn to make space, which different places are starting to, for different ways of sharing knowledge. And that sharing knowledge is not always formatted and collated and, you know, stamped, certified, authorized in this kind of westernized ivory tower scientific method. And that part of doing that is centering indigenous epistemologies and hermeneutics, you know, ways of understanding the world and the viewpoints that we come from, because we're still in a mode where we're fighting to center these, as opposed to improving why they work better, right? And so if I have to argue in a paper for 5 pages why this basket is theory and has a story and is connected to a family and land and water and what it means, as opposed to saying, hey, this basket is important and this is a story that you don't need to have access to, I think also matters.
Yeah, so we just have a few more minutes. Adam, if you wanted to.
Did you want to field that?
Or actually, I'm just kind of thinking, because I haven't done my defense yet, but I'm thinking of going back to my master's, and when my mom and dad were there, as well as my niece, my sister, my husband was there, my daughter Maria was there, so my family was there for sure, but it was still really formalized, you know. And then at the time when I was doing my master's research, I didn't know it was at a time where Indigenous research methodologies wasn't even really that emergent yet, eh? And so when I went in there, I really had to pretend that I was in the teepee lodge and that I was about ready to get my face painted by my grandpa Mookakin. And so that for me brought a lot of comfort. And I'm actually experiencing a lot of anxiety around my oral defense for my PhD, probably coming up here in the spring, right? If everything goes well, knock on wood. But I'm having a lot of anxiety around that. And so I'm trying to think about it in terms of making this big talk, but also remembering that I need to honor those stories, and that, you know, knowing and knowledge are like really two different things. And that really came clear for me when I was doing some of this research for this International Indigenous Studies class I'm teaching, and anyways, and just this idea that knowledge and knowing is very different, you know, and that knowledge is based in, you know, like the theory and the, you know, the books and all of that, and all of those 200 and plus references at the end of your dissertation, right? But knowing is those relationships that you have, and getting to know yourself more, right? And how do you bring those into an oral defense and have those two kind of epistemologies recognized, you know, and that, you know, the knowing, my knowing isn't testable, you know, and why do I have to defend it? You know, why do I, you know, have to defend that? So I'm having a lot of anxiety around that, but I just keep my, you know, the teepee lodge centered. I keep my grandpa, my ancestors there, and I think about it in a way of I'm getting my face painted and I'm making this big talk and hoping that that they trust that I know myself enough to pass this test, right?
You know, it's interesting because, like, when I was doing my comprehensive exams, my advisor was an industrial organizational psychologist. Okay, that's how I got into that field. He had 5 different research streams: leadership and creativity and innovation. Keith James is his name, and he had one that was just native stuff. So when I applied, I said, "That's what I want to work on. I don't care about any of that stuff," right? And so I was in this field that. It was a happy accident, but really, like, it wasn't my intention to go there. And so when I was doing my comprehensive exams, I'm getting, you know, our field has research for about 100 years. It's some of the biggest research. It's financed primarily by corporate and multinationals, right? So it's huge, lots of stuff everywhere. And I'm studying this stuff, and I'm like, I don't know if this is me. Like, why do I got to go up against this panel? Like, are they going to tell me that I'm good enough to contribute to my community's welfare? Like, why do I got to do this? And I was hating life on it. And you know, there's a different like scenario going on. You know, ultimately, like I motivated myself by saying, like, I'm going to get through this so that I can do the stuff that I want to do. I'll get into rooms that I wouldn't be able to get into. I'll have opportunities to speak to policy, to speak to power like I wouldn't be able to, and if this is what I got to do for it, right? But in a population where there's a surplus of labor, education really works to separate people, to that you sift out ones for different employers, right? And so that rank and filing system, because we all need a rite of passage, right? It's a difficult thing. But the fact that you're going it alone, I feel like that's a value that's captured in the current dissertation thesis structure, as opposed to being like, we're grooming you up because our community has a lot of needs, our society has a lot of needs, and you're smart and you're motivated. Like, let's bring you up, let's celebrate it that, you know, that you've made some rite of passage, because your job now is to give all the resources that we've pounded into you back. Right? You're not supposed to use it for yourself. Right. You're not supposed to just go and be successful and then this is my job. Yeah. You know? And you know, I don't think it works for good theorizing. I don't think it works for good research anyways. But you know, the purpose of why we're all on this path, I think there's a component that we could bring to the indigenous reframing of that, I guess. So that different values are emphasized in the process, different accomplishments are celebrated, right? Rather than you now elevating your status in the human species. It's like, no, now you've got more responsibility to go and help your...
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say personally, but also collectively, speaking about relationality and relationships, I think is the strongest thread that we've heard here today, but also voice and narrative and power, our individual power that also gives back to the collective. So as a Métis grad student, I just want to say thank you for paving the way for us that are to come behind you and support your work, and hopefully we can leave something behind as well. So I just wanted to collectively say thank you on behalf of all of us. Thank you to everybody for coming out. We wanted to shout out to Dan. He was the mover behind all of the technology in terms of posters, Marketo, RSVPs.